Hi. Today we're going to be talking about critical and cultural approaches to scientific modeling and questioning. And so we have a very ambitious agenda, but today we're going to be talking about modeling and what it can look like online. We'll take some time to understand modeling from a critical and cultural stance. We'll have some activities for you where you and a partner can stop and reflect on what it means to take a critical and cultural stance towards scientific modeling, how to develop back pocket questions, and then you and your partner will have some time to develop an inquiry cycle. What we hope is that the inquiry cycles you develop, you have an opportunity to implement them and collect data around them with your partner. And then we can come back in the next few months through more sessions to talk about how this went. So before we get started, we have a turn and talk for you. The question is, what do you do with divergent ideas? And when we say divergent ideas, we mean it broadly. What do you do around students' sense making, around their experiences, personal connections, partial ideas about a phenomenon? So go ahead and pause your video for about 2 minutes and talk with your sidebar buddy. Welcome back. So let's dive into scientific modeling. So if you look at the graphic here on your right, you'll see that developing and using models is at the center of all the practices. And the reason why it is that way is because developing and using models leverages the other scientific practices, and hopefully that will become more clear over time. As you're developing and using models, you're engaging in a range of scientific and engineering practices, such as asking questions, analyzing and interpreting data, engaging in argument from evidence. And so developing and using models is a high leverage practice in that it brings in the other science and engineering practices. And so today, we're going to be talking about models and modeling. So the models are, as you see in the upper right, a way for students to show what they know and how they know it. But modeling is also a practice that unfolds over the course of your unit. And I'll talk about what that means in just a second. So this practice of modeling, it's a process. And I apologize for this busy slide, but I wanted to capture the different dimensions of the modeling practice. And so initially, when we start off a unit with modeling, we begin with a phenomenon. And that phenomenon is a way for students to think about what's going on with a particular event in the world. And so initially, what we want students to do is to develop their initial models. And you'll see here in the upper right, a student was given the phenomenon, draw and write why Ersktown loses power so often. There are multiple answers. So this is an entry point for students to think about what could be going on here. And so they, through drawings and explanations, articulate the components and their relationships to support why, this phenomenon is happening. So this initial model is a way for students to have an entry point into, bringing forth those different ideas that they have around what's going on. As the unit unfolds, there are opportunities for students to seek evidence through the lessons around how, around the different scientific ideas and principles that can help us make sense of the phenomenon. And so as the lessons unfold through Amplify, students will be engaging in lessons and then answering some questions locally, but also thinking about how those investigations apply back to the anchoring phenomenon, which is the blackout here in this case. Also, as students are gathering evidence, they're going to be revising their models, right? And so their hypotheses may be enriching or they might change over time. And this is a good thing, right? Because students through the lessons are gaining more experience with the different scientific concepts and principles, and then they're asked to think about how this relates back to the phenomenon. And then finally, at the end, they're developing the final model and explanation, and this is an opportunity for them to put together all of the pieces of evidence that they've collected and to put forth a final model about, what happens in the phenomenon, in this case, what happened with the blackout. And so again, a key process here is revising models. students have an initial model, they're gaining evidence through the different lessons, and then over time, they're going to have more information that they can put together in their final model. And we just wanted to kind of show you the different apps that we've seen to support online modeling. On the left, you see Seesaw. We've seen second graders use this online platform to engage in modeling. And on the right is Flipend, and we've seen fifth graders engage in this platform for modeling. So there could be many other options out there, but we just wanted to put forth some examples that we saw. Here's an example of how a teacher, Rachel Shear from Queen Anne Elementary, used Seesaw with her students while they were doing models. This video is available on Microsoft Teams, and I'm just gonna play a quick 2-minute clip about how a student revised their models using Seesaw.
Here's what the student's response looks like after I prove it for their journal. Only the student, her family, and I can view the work once it's approved. Let's listen in to this student's response. I noticed revised thinking, scientific explanation, and citing evidence. I wonder what you notice.
Hello, my name is Elsa, and this is a very famous camp. I forget the name, but there's some mystery, and so the camp used to be 2 meters far away from the cliff, and now it's 1 meter away from the cliff. And then climate change, which is kind of funny. But now that I've done more research and stuff, now I think the waves got way, way, way bigger and could get tall enough and crashed and took down part of the mountain. Because in this book called Bob something, it said that big enough waves can crush rock or sand. So then I started thinking. Anyway, so that's my idea. You may disagree, but yeah. Bye. Well,
And so as we think about what modeling will look like, what instruction will look like in the fall and beyond, we're all focused on taking instruction online and ensuring student engagement. But how do we also use this moment to disrupt racial injustice and inequitable practices to promote a rightful presence of all learners in our classrooms? And racial justice is a big piece to tackle, but we can start in our classrooms and can use our fellow teachers and networks and as partners for this work. And so today we're going to talk about what it means to be critically and culturally responsive to students' models. We're also going to think about what happens when these two pieces come together so that we're being both critically and culturally responsive to students' models. And so I want us to think about what it means to be critically reflective. And before we do that, I want to put forth this idea of critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is the ability to identify, critique, and challenge the social forces that produce inequality and oppression. And to develop this critical consciousness, we need to develop a language of critique. We need to develop some critical reflection questions for ourselves. Whose perspectives are reflected in this work? Whose are absent? Whose interests are being served? Whose are not? What values are being transmitted, and who has power in this situation, and where does it come from? So these are critical reflection questions that we can ask of ourselves, in all walks of life. We can even do it in the classroom and do it around the work around modeling instruction. The second piece that I want to tackle is the culture part. What does it mean to be culturally responsive? So as human beings, no matter who we are, where we live, or what languages we speak at home, We all have our ways of knowing, talking, valuing, acting as we live in our day-to-day lives inside family and community. These ways of living are what is now understood as culture. Indeed, across communities, human beings make sense of the world in ways that are both similar and different. And so science is about understanding the natural world, and human beings have different ways of making sense of the natural world, ways that are similar and ways that are different. And so I just want to, drive home this concept of culture a little bit more. So culture is not a trait that some people have and others don't. We are all cultural beings. And we're all cultural beings because we have ways in which we engage and make sense of the world as we participate in everyday activities of our communities. So multiple dimensions matter here. Science knowledge matters. What do we already understand about the natural world and phenomenon? Personal and community history matters. What lived experiences do we draw on as we make sense of the natural world? Language and representation matters. What kinds of how do we use language to make sense of the natural world, and how do we represent our ideas without words? And so in the modeling context, how do we use drawings to make sense of a phenomenon? Race, power, and justice matter. And so race, power, and justice shape students' identities and agency in the world, and that will affect how we perceive and make sense of a phenomenon. And through this student work, I hope that we get to see how these different dimensions manifest themselves. And so models are a great way of eliciting and building on students' prior knowledge and experiences. And we do this because we want to honor the expertise that students have. They're not just blank slates. Students have observed the world for many, many years, and they already have theories and partial ideas about how phenomena work. They're an opportunity for students to think both specifically about a phenomenon, but also think generally about the scientific forces and principles at play. And then it's an opportunity for us to think, for students to engage in multiple modes of representation and communication. So for them to use drawings, explanations, and multiple languages to make sense of a phenomenon. So again, I want to return back to these framing ideas and think about what this means for modeling. So reflecting critically. Reflecting critically requires us to be aware of the biases or assumptions that we bring about what students are representing and what they are capable of. And so, as we are engaging in students' models, are we being open to the different ways that students have of communicating their understanding of models? Or are we just looking for the right answer and trying to funnel students in that direction? Students' cultural expertise. Again, modeling is a way for students to show, how they're making sense of the different scientific ideas, their experiences, and the different language and cultural backgrounds that they have to make sense of a phenomenon. When these two components come together, that's where we get critical and cultural responsiveness. And there's multiple ways to be critically and culturally responsive to models, but today we're going to focus on using back pocket questions as a way of bringing these two concepts together, because back pocket questions are a way to both honor and support students' ideas, and it also makes space for divergent thinking. And it's about honoring and leveraging the connections that the students are making to the science. So an SPS teacher had a very nice way of thinking about critically reflecting on students' models. She says, you see deeper into what they're really thinking, and sometimes a student that you think that is really at a low level can surprise you by the picture and by what they're trying to say. I have this one kid, he hated writing. Writing for him was the worst time ever. But when it came to science, wow, it was like I saw a different child just because of what he produced for those models. So again, with a different perspective, it made me realize that he had more potential that I was giving him credit for, because sometimes we create our own biases. And so I wanted to return to the slide that you probably saw at the beginning of the week, which is thinking about students' cultural expertise in modeling, but also engaging in critically reflective questions that can support you to understand students' personal sense making around the phenomenon. And so again, some of the reflection questions are, you know, am I only asking for the right answer? If so, what kinds of questions can I ask that open up students' thinking? And so we're gonna be using back pocket questions to really dive into what the students are saying and the connections that they're making. So putting it together one more time, critical and cultural responsiveness, it's about creating equitable learning opportunities that depends critically on teachers' skill in seeing and hearing students' ideas and reasoning as connected to science, as opposed to being off topic or worse, disruptive. And so we have an activity for you with your partner. And the question is, what does it mean to take a critical and cultural stance to scientific modeling? So we have a vignette on the next slide, and we have some questions for you and your partner to think about. So here is a vignette from a kindergarten class. And this vignette is also in the resources that you got for this module. So here are the questions that we would like for you and your partner to reflect on. What ideas came up for you as you read this vignette? What assumptions did you have about students from non-Western cultures who speak non-English languages? And remember, this is an opportunity for critical reflection and growth. As you explore these questions, please be kind and honest with yourselves. So go ahead and pause your videos and take about 10 minutes to talk about this vignette with your partner. Okay, welcome back. So, as I said, we're going to be talking a little bit today about the development of back pocket questions. And so why back pocket questions? Well, back pocket questions are a way to deepen students' explanations. They're also a way to support students to make sense of their observations, ideas, and to connect to larger science ideas. And so here are some features of back pocket questions. It's about asking students to share their observations and experiences and cultural backgrounds in their models. It's about prompting students to hypothesize about the observations and experiences that they see. And finally, it's about leaving the student with a question or a task. And today we're gonna just focus on the asking and prompting part of the back pocket question. So while I do that, let me actually get my back pocket questions out. Here they are. Okay. So as you make sense of this part and think about back pocket questions, I'm gonna direct you to the what, how, why matrix that you have for each of your units. This can help in the development of back pocket questions. So feel free to leverage this as a resource. So here is an example of a model from a 4th grade classroom. And again, the phenomenon the students are investigating here are, why does Ersktown lose power so often? So here's what the student is saying. Maybe there's a lot of wind in Ersktown and the wind maybe shook the power line in and out of place, and soon the wind pushed it back in place. And so what do we see in the student's model? The student is both saying and showing that there's a lot of wind in Ersktown, and the wind is shaking the power line out of and back into place. So here are some potential back pocket questions. I noticed that you are saying the wind is moving the power lines out of and back into place. Have you seen this happen in yours or someone else's neighborhood? So this is an example of asking. I'm seeing the students make an observation, and I'm asking them to tell me more about it. Another back pocket question I can ask is, when the wind shakes the power line, how might this cause a blackout? So here I'm prompting the student to tell me, to hypothesize about why this is happening. So through back pocket questions, I'm doing a series of asking and prompting. And here's an example of the student's final model. And you'll notice that the student's explanation is richer, and they also have more ways of representing what's happening in the blackout through their drawings. And so here is what the student's initial hypothesis was and their final hypothesis. And I want to kind of show you some of the changes that I see from the initial to the final hypothesis. And so initially, the student was taking a what lens in their hypothesis. They were describing an observation. They were both saying and showing that there's a lot of wind and that the wind is shaking the power line in and out of place. Notice in the final hypothesis, the student is now taking on a how lens. They're explaining the process of why this is happening. So they're saying a tree fell down on the power lines and it got tangled in the power line and the energy couldn't travel to other places. And so they're not just saying that, you know, there's an issue with the power lines. They're saying what specifically is going on with the power lines that is causing the blackout. And so the back pocket questions are a great way to enrich students' understanding of the phenomenon by prompting them to think more deeply about their hypothesis and to connect it to the scientific principles. But we also want to look at the backside of students' models because they can reveal students' cultural expertise. So why do we want to look at the backside of the model? Well, it's a way for us to uncover personal connections. Students can often relate how they're emotionally and intellectually connected to the phenomenon, which can make them more invested and interested in pursuing it. It's a way to understand impact, so students can identify connections from the content and think about ways to take action in the world. So for example, in the blackout unit, we noticed that a student talked about rewiring light sockets with parents. It's an opportunity to provide multiple access points to a phenomenon. So the students might use the backside as a way to continue to refine the hypothesis that they presented on the front side. And it's a way to encourage storytelling. Students may use varied narrative forms to tell stories about connections to their own lives. And so here is an example of the backside of a model. And so what do we see here? The student is using both Spanish and English. The student is using questioning. One of the characters in the model here is saying que, which means why. And it seems like the student is telling a story about the lights going out. So how can I use this information to inform my back pocket questions? So here are some examples of ways that I can approach this model with back pocket questions. Can you tell me who the people in the conversation are? How are they making sense of what is happening? So here I'm asking the student to build on their story. So here I'm asking. Another set of questions I can ask is, what do the wavy lines represent? Why are the lines between the people on the left different than the ones next to them on the right? So here I am prompting the student to explain their representation to me. What do these wavy lines represent? And why are they different in different parts of the model? Another series of questions that I can ask is, what happened that day and how do you think this caused the lights to go out? So here I'm asking the student what happened that day, tell me more about the story, but I'm also prompting them to go deeper into the explanation. How do you think this caused the lights to go out? And so there's a lot of different combinations of ask and prompt back pocket questions that you can use. And so now it's your turn. There are samples of student work for your unit in the resources folder that include both the front side and the back side of the models. With a partner, come up with a couple of back pocket questions for the students' responses. So go ahead and pause your video for about 20 minutes and think of some back pocket questions. Welcome back. Now it's time to develop a cycle of inquiry. And so this is an opportunity for you to take some risks and challenges. Think about how you might implement this in your classroom, what you might learn, and how that can inform your practice. And so we have, so here is broadly how we conceive of this cycle. You know, we have some questions about student learning. We plan, you know, a set of observations that we're going to do. We take this data, reflect on it, and think about the next steps. So here are the two inquiry cycles that we've proposed for you, 2 different types of studies. One is about exploring divergent ideas and hypotheses around the phenomenon through the use of back pocket questions. And then the other one is about analyzing and building on students' experiences and connections to the phenomenon throughout the course of instruction, so throughout the unit. So let me talk about each of these in more detail. So the first one is about exploring divergent ideas and hypotheses around the phenomenon through the use of back pocket questions. And so here is what that will consist of. As you are looking at students' models, this is a way for you to think about what are some of the cultural and cognitive expertise that you notice in your students' models. And we have some questions for you to help you with your noticings. And then we want you to write some back pocket questions that you can use for students to help them explore and expand on their own ideas in deeper ways. The second study that we have is for you to analyze and build on the students' experiences and connections to the phenomenon. And so recall earlier, I talked about, when we think about culture, there are many dimensions that we need to look at to see how students are sense making. We need to look at their science knowledge. We need to look at how they use language and representation, how they think about race, power, and justice, and also to think about their histories and possible futures. And so this is an opportunity for you to think about how these different dimensions are showing up in students' models. And then once you kind of identified them, how can you meaningfully leverage them in your lessons and throughout the unit? And so thank you all for joining us today. We do have an exit ticket for you that's in the one-pager. We would like to learn more about how this session went with you, so if you can take a few minutes and fill it out, that would be great. You do get 2 clock hours for participation, and we hope to make this an ongoing cycle where we do more videos throughout the year, and we would love for you to come back to future sessions, but also if you're not able to, please send us your feedback because we would love to know how this is going. Thanks so much for participating. Oh, and finally, we do have some additional resources for you, and this is built into the one-pager. Thanks so much.